There is an elephant in the room, and it's not an easy discussion. A part of that discussion entails dealing with emotions, dealing with the culture around us, and it's that idea of what we have been as a church versus where are we going as a church.
All right, welcome everyone. This is our 31st podcast, Renew Your Mind. With us today is Senior Pastor Paul Grunberg and Family and Youth Pastor Jordan Chambers and myself, Dana Hall, as the moderator. We're coming to you from the First United Methodist Church, and we're located on 215 South Center Street in Gaylord. And if you have any questions before or after the podcast, no, not before, but after the podcast, you can call 989-732-5380. We did want to put in a plug for our soup lunches that we're going to have in the up and coming weeks during Lent, and they will be on Wednesdays. We've checked with the health department, and we have everything in place to be able to have some in-service lunches, and we will also have takeout options. So everyone knows how great the soup is, so please join us.
And the pie.
And the pie.
Pretty big deal.
Pretty big deal, yeah. It always sells out. So.
Oh, yeah.
All right. So what we want to get into our next podcast sessions is wanted to talk about what's going on in the Methodist Church right now. And I guess I'll tee it up like this: is wanted to find out, kind of talk about that elephant in the room question. What is going on with the current or maybe probable separation of the Methodist Church? And it seems to be a topic that people are either afraid to ask questions about or not sure if they should already know this stuff. So I'm just going to open it up. What's going on?
Do you know how many home runs Babe Ruth hit?
I don't.
That's a question people are afraid to ask because they don't know, right?
Yeah,
They
that's
don't have
a
the
great
answer.
analogy.
There is an elephant in the room, and it's not an easy discussion. A part of that discussion entails dealing with emotions, dealing with the culture around us, and it's that idea of what we have been as a church versus where are we going as a church. And one of the words you used, Dana, was separation. And the interesting thing about that word, especially now for us, is that we're like, oh, we can't do this. And separation is bad. But historically, even within United Methodism, but historically, back to the time of the Apostle Paul, there were issues within the people that called themselves Christians. There were the Christians that were listening and following Paul, the apostles, and then there were zealots who were Christians who believed in Jesus but believed you needed to follow all of the Old Testament law still. And then there were the Judaizers who believed that you needed to follow some of the law, like circumcision. The Judaizers would say, hey, you know what? You can believe in Jesus, but you still need to be circumcised. And the apostles said, no, that's not the case. And so there's always been a little bit of tension in the church moving forward. And then we talk about the creeds. There's the Roman Creed, where we're not exactly sure where it came from. We believe the apostles. But then the Apostles' Creed, which is the much broader creed that most people know. And then there was the Nicene Creed, which was ratified at Nicaea, hence the Nicene Creed, in the 400s. And that really set the stage for Christianity for the next almost 600 years.
Can you remind us what a creed is, just kind of high level? When you say Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, what did those tell us? Not what did they tell us, but
it affirmed who God is based on biblical text.
Yeah, a creed would be a statement of faith.
Mm-hmm.
And
okay.
in the surrounding, in those instances specifically, the reason that they became such an important part of agreement and affirmation of the early church is because there were a whole bunch of groups, and they were heretics. In other words, they were people who were arguing against the truth of Orthodox Christianity.
Mainly who Jesus is.
Yeah, there was a
It
couple of
surrounded
them.
it.
Mhm.
There were some that said that Christ was a created being, that he was just a human. There were some that were saying that he was not even a human; he was just an entity, a spirit that looked like he was a person, and he didn't even actually really die on the cross because he was just a spirit, kind of like a ghost that could touch things.
Mhm.
There's a lot of different weird and strange beliefs that went way out of bounds for Christianity,
Right.
and they needed to bring everyone back to the center and say, okay, hold on, let's just make sure we all agree and know what we're talking about when we say Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and and who the Holy Spirit is, and those kind of concepts. So, Arianism and Pelagianism, the idea that God is powerless but has to respond to the things we do, that he's not sovereign. These are ideas that came up at those points that they had to say, you know what, we need to make sure everyone is aware of what we agree on.
Let's keep the main thing the main thing.
Yeah.
Because even then,
This is the main thing.
that's
Yeah.
right. Yeah. Back then, the hundreds of bishops that gathered together to make those creeds were not in total agreement in all things theology. There were some of them that had leanings toward different mindsets and beliefs that included eschatology, that included end times theology. There was even then agreements and disagreements about the prophecies of what would happen. There was also, because of Plato's recommendations of the creation, there was even back then an argument on creation and the timelines of those things, and the purpose and the wording of Genesis and things like that. So those kind of arguments have been around a long time, much longer than just what we imagine them to be. But they all agreed on the core of Christianity, the center of what we believe and live out in our practice. And those creeds, those statements of agreed upon faith, were determined so that we could all move forward in agreement, even past and acknowledging the minor disagreement that we
Right.
may have along the way.
Gotcha. Okay.
So that tension has always existed. Keeping the core creeds in mind, about 1000 AD, there was a split or a separation between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Catholic Church. And the Eastern Catholic Church would have some more separations and become the Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, some other churches because of some disagreements that they had. In the 1400s, that would be the Reformation, time of the Reformation, where Martin Luther, a Catholic priest, had some problems with what the Catholic Church was doing, and they were really doing some stupid things in my mind.
Even the modern Catholic Church has, I don't want to say repented or recanted, they haven't done that, but they have acknowledged publicly that during that time, Martin Luther had valid claims against the church in some of his 95 theses.
Right, and they refused to address those theses at that point in time.
At that time, yeah.
And then, as far as our origins as United Methodists, there was an Anglican priest. Well, the Anglican Church started because King Henry VIII wanted a divorce from his wife because she wasn't bearing him a son or an heir, and so the Catholic Church wouldn't give it to him. So he created the Church of England, what we know as the Anglican Church today. And from the Anglican Church, there was a priest named John Wesley who started, and you can go back to some of our other podcasts where we talk about Wesley, but he created a method so that people could come to know Jesus, grow in their faith. I mean, very intentional, which did not exist back then. I mean, he was the cutting edge. And Methodism started, and then even within Methodism, once it came over to America, we've had a number of splits. There was, and I don't have my listing here, there were a number of splits in the 1800s, a lot of them around racism or slavery. We had the big split between the Methodist North and the Methodist South when I think it was a bishop refused to release his wives' slaves. something like that.
Yeah.
That was in the 1800 period.
1800.
Actually, right in the middle of the Civil War, it was
Okay.
about 1863 or 64.
I think
is
64, yeah.
when the Free Methodist Church broke off and formed the Free Methodist Church. And it was predominantly a northern aspect, although there were still many in the Episcopal Methodist Church at the time is what it was called. They listed 3 reasons for the break off. Number one was they believed in the freedom of all men in equal measure. So in other words, they didn't believe in slaves or slavery. They didn't believe the church should condone it. Second, they believed they were anti-Freemason. So they were against the presence of Masons in the church and the inclusion of really not just Masons, but secretive clubs. They felt like that went against the grain of communal Christian living. And they thought that there were some idolatrous things occurring that they were wanting to buck against. And so they were against the Masons at the time, which was also kind of a political thing to do. And then the third one was, at that time, the Methodist Church, along with many other churches, allowed for folks to purchase their own pews.
Pew tax.
Yeah. And so you could basically say, this pew is reserved, it is mine. You're not allowed to sit in it, and 2 people could take an entire pew because they paid for it. And what that ended up doing was the poor people who couldn't afford to pay for a pew were forced to stand outside the doors in order to participate in worship. They could just listen through the windows.
Got it.
And the Free Methodist Church said, that is not the freedom of worship. That is, that's going against what the book of James says when it says, don't cater to the rich in your congregation, but let the poor man have the footstool. So they got this 3-pronged, free-themed argument that they said these are the reasons why. One thing I want to really hammer, because it's important to today's conversation, is when it came to slavery, the proposed solution was called contextualization back then, or the contextual plan. It was, there are churches that support slavery and there are churches that don't. Let's just stay a denomination, and the churches that want to can, and the churches that don't want to don't have to. In other words, they put it into the hands of the congregations of those churches to decide for themselves if they would support slavery. And the split happened nonetheless because they said all that does is it gives room for a massive moral failure on the part of a large percentage of the church.
Got it. Okay.
And so they said, if you're going to let slavery happen, we're just not going to be a part of that. We don't want to be attached to it at all. Even if you say some churches don't have to have slaves, some churches can have slaves, that was too far. And so they split, they left. And that was the first big one. But there's others that have that racial tendency as well.
That was the 1866
Yeah.
in that area.
The African-American group, it was a few decades after that they split. And they formed what's known as the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME churches. The heinous crime in Charlottesville, where I believe it's Charlottesville, where the gentleman came and
participated in
shot
the study.
He came to a Bible study and shot the participants of the Bible study and killed many members. That was an AME church. The pastor of that church was actually, I believe, a Democratic politician as well as the ordained minister of the church. And it was just a massive, heinous crime against, people just worshiping. And so there, even to this day, you see that some of those things exist.
So there have always been reasons to separate. What makes where we are today, and again, a lot of the reasons to separate before were more based on race, as far as within the United Methodist Church, the Free Methodist Church. A lot of that was during a lot of racial tension. And so we have been, for most of us who weren't around in 68, we have not been exposed to the tension of separating because of something. And in 68, the Methodist Church, and eventually actually in the early 1900s, the Methodist North and South came back together again after 90 some years, along with one of the other branches that had broken off. So there was a lot of celebration then. And then in 68, the United Brethren or a portion of the United Brethren and the Methodist Church, Methodist Episcopal Church, came together and formed the United Methodist Church.
Yeah.
Okay, say that one more time. In 1968,
The United Brethren Church, so united there, and the Methodist Episcopal Church joined together and became the United Methodist Church.
got it.
And even in its early days, there was tension. And it's a tension that didn't it got addressed, and it's been addressed at annual conferences since then. And it leads us to where we find ourselves today. But I see we're running out of time.
Yeah,
So you'll
that's
just have to
probably a
come
really
back.
good segue. I do have a question. I'll come back with it. But at the United Conference, do you think the tensions are more, obviously the tensions are more visible there? And do you think that's why a lot of people are not educated about where their church is at, because they don't want any part of listening to that, conference?
That's a great question to start
So,
our next podcast
Anyway,
with.
okay, well, we will end it there. Thank you, everyone. Remember the soup lunches. And if you have any questions, we're at 989-732-5380. Thanks, everyone.